What happens when the most feared crime lord in New Orleans meets the one woman his dying grandmother actually wants to see again? A chubby, broke waitress from the Tremé who smells like beignet grease and has absolutely no idea who she's dealing with. She wasn't a socialite. She wasn't a model on some cartel boss's arm. She was Willa Mae Tatum, 26 years old, 5'3", 260 pounds of tired, and she was just trying to get through a Tuesday. Aurelio Santerre controlled the port of New Orleans the way the Mississippi controlled the land, quietly, inevitably, and without asking anyone's permission. He was 41 years old, with the kind of face that belonged on a Renaissance painting and the kind of reputation that made city councilmen lose their appetites at dinner. He ran the Santerre syndicate the way his father and his father's father had run it before him, through patience, precision, and a cold, surgical ruthlessness that had never once failed him. Until his grandmother got sick. Odette Santerre was 83 years old, and she was the only human being alive who could make Aurelio feel like a boy who had forgotten to wipe his shoes at the door. She had raised him after his parents died in a boating accident on Lake Pontchartrain when he was 9. She had braided her fingers through his hair on hard nights and pressed his cheek against her chest and told him that the world was not as cruel as it seemed if you knew how to look. She was the one good thing he had never managed to corrupt by proximity. 3 weeks ago, Odette had a stroke. The doctors at Tulane Medical Center said she was stable, but her memory was drifting. She would wake in the middle of the night calling for people who had been dead for 40 years. She would reach for faces that weren't there. But she kept asking for one person by name. Not his lieutenant, not the priest who gave her communion every Sunday at St. Augustine, Willa. She kept asking for Willa. It took Aurelio's people 3 days to figure out who she meant. Odette had volunteered for years at a women's shelter in the Tremé, a detail Aurelio had always respected but never involved himself in. The shelter's kitchen volunteer coordinator, a woman named Celestine, told them about Willa Mae Tatum. Willa had volunteered every Saturday morning for 2 years, helping Odette serve breakfast, learning her recipes, listening to her stories. Apparently, the two of them had developed the kind of friendship that didn't care about age or circumstance, the kind that forms over industrial pots of red beans and rice and too much laughter for 6 in the morning. Willa didn't know who Odette's grandson was. Celestine confirmed it. Willa just knew her as Miss Odette, the most elegant old woman she had ever met, who also wasn't afraid to tell you when your seasoning was off. When the shelter closed due to funding cuts 8 months ago, they had lost touch. Aurelio sent his man Fletcher to find her. Fletcher found her on a Tuesday night at the tail end of a double shift at a diner on Magazine Street, wiping down the counter at 11:45 p.m., her hair escaping from its bun in every direction, a smear of hot sauce on the sleeve of her uniform that she hadn't noticed. She looked exhausted. She looked ordinary. She looked nothing like anyone who had ever been brought to Aurelio Santerre's attention. Fletcher laid $300 bills on the counter, needed her help with an elderly woman named Odette, starting tomorrow morning. Willa stared at the money for a long time. Then she looked up and said, flatly, "Is Miss Odette okay? Not, what's this for? Not who sent you. Just, is she okay?" Fletcher reported this back to Aurelio, who didn't know what to do with it. Willa showed up the next morning at the Santerre estate in the Garden District, carrying a paper bag from Café du Monde, and wearing a yellow dress that had been washed so many times the pattern had softened to something close to watercolor. She was round everywhere, round face, round arms, hips that moved with the comfortable authority of a woman who had stopped apologizing for the space she occupied sometime around age 22. She had deep brown skin and dark eyes that took everything in quickly, and she walked up the front steps of one of the most expensive private residences in Louisiana with the expression of someone who had made peace with whatever was going to happen next. The guard at the door looked her up and down with open skepticism. "Willa Tatum," she said. "I was told to come at 9. The guard muttered into his earpiece. After a pause, the door swung open. She was led through a house that felt more like a museum than a home. 14-foot ceilings, crown molding, a grand staircase that curved like a question mark, oil portraits of Santerre men going back to the 1800s watching her from every wall. She was put in a sitting room and told to wait. She sat. She put the Café du Monde bag in her lap and smoothed her dress over her thick thighs, and waited. Aurelio walked in without announcing himself. He stopped a few feet inside the door, and for a moment neither of them spoke. He was wearing a charcoal linen shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, which exposed the edge of a tattoo she couldn't quite read from this distance. He was tall, dark-haired, going silver at the sides, and he had the particular stillness of someone who had learned long ago that moving first was a kind of weakness, was a gun. His eyes moved over her the way they moved over everything, assessing, filing, deciding. He wasn't entirely sure what he had expected. Something harder, maybe. Something more guarded. She looked at him the way you look at someone you're trying to figure out, and then she said, "You're her grandson." It wasn't a question. "You have her eyes," Willa added simply, and then she looked down at the paper bag. "I brought her beignets. I don't know if she's allowed, but she used to talk about them all the time at the shelter. She said the ones from the restaurant weren't the same as the ones her mother used to make, but the smell was close enough to be comforting." Aurelio said nothing. "I can leave them at the door if she's on a restricted diet," Willa said. I wanted to bring her something." Aurelio had not been caught off guard by another human being in approximately 11 years. The last time had been when his grandmother told him she was proud of him, despite everything, which had also rendered him temporarily speechless. "She can have one," he said. Willa nodded. He took her up. Odette was in a wide, sun-filled room on the second floor, propped against a stack of pillows, her white hair pinned neatly, a rosary coiled in one hand. She was small and paper-thin, in a way she hadn't been 8 months ago, and when the door opened she turned toward it with the blank, searching expression that strokes sometimes leave behind. Then she saw Willa. Something in her face reorganized itself, slowly, like a dawn. "Oh," Odette breathed. "Oh, there you are." Willa crossed the room without hesitating. She sat on the edge of the bed, set the paper bag on the nightstand, and took Odette's free hand in both of hers. Her full, warm hands, the ones that had been kneading dough and wiping counters and steadying other people's coffee cups for years. "I'm here, Miss Odette," she said quietly. "I'm sorry it took me so long." Standing in the doorway, Aurelio watched his grandmother's shoulders drop 1.5 inches, a release he hadn't seen in 3 weeks. Odette's hand tightened around Willa's, and she closed her eyes, and the expression on her face was something so close to peace that it felt almost inappropriate to look at directly. He looked anyway. By the end of the week, the arrangement had shifted without anyone formally discussing it. Willa came every morning. She sat with Odette through the better part of the day, reading to her, relearning the specific rhythms of her moods, learning which memories were floating loose and which ones were still anchored. She brought food from the diner on her days off, or made things in the Santerre kitchen with a cheerful irreverence toward the professional chef's organized pantry that initially horrified the staff and then, gradually, won them over. She left smells behind her. Chicory, vanilla, warm bread that moved through the formal, silent rooms of that house. Aurelio found himself coming home earlier than he needed to. He told himself it was to check on his grandmother. He watched Willa through the kitchen doorway on a Thursday evening while she taught Odette's private nurse, a young man named Elliot, how to make the red beans and rice that Odette had been requesting. She was standing at the stove in one of the aprons she'd started keeping in the second drawer, her back to the door, narrating her own movements in that low, unhurried voice of hers that somehow managed to be both instructional and conversational at the same time. "You can't rush the onion," she was telling Elliot. "People always want to rush the onion. But the onion knows. It'll get soft when it's ready, and not a minute before. You try to force it, and it just gets mean." Elliot, who was 23 and from Vermont, and had never made red beans and rice in his life, was nodding with the intense focus of someone attending a lecture. Willa stirred something slowly and added, almost to herself, "Most things are like that, actually. You can't rush them. You just have to keep showing up and trust the process." Aurelio leaned against the doorframe with his arms crossed and thought about how long it had been since someone said something in a room he was in that he actually wanted to think about afterward. "That's either very wise," he said, "or you're just talking about beans." Willa turned around, startled but not alarmed. She'd gotten used to him appearing at thresholds. "Mr. Santerre," she wiped her hands on the apron. "Both, probably. Have you eaten?" "I'll eat when I get home. You work a double shift tomorrow." She raised an eyebrow at him. "I do." "Then eat here. Elliot can finish." It wasn't a warm invitation. It was the way he offered most things, as a statement of logistics, with no room left in the sentence for refusal. But Willa had been in service long enough to recognize the difference between someone giving orders and someone doing something that cost them something. She pulled out a stool at the kitchen island and sat. She ate the red beans and rice. He had a glass of something amber on the rocks and didn't comment on much of anything, but he didn't leave either. After a while, she said, "She talked about you, you know. At the shelter, she never said your name, but I could tell she was talking about someone she loved that she was also scared for." Aurelio looked at his glass. "She used to say, 'Some people are given gifts that can be used for good or for harm, and it breaks your heart to watch them choose. But you keep loving them anyway, because love isn't contingent on what people do with what they were given.'" Silence. Then, "She said that about a lot of people at that shelter." "She did," Willow agreed. "But the way she said it when she was talking about you was different. The way she held her breath after." Aurelio didn't respond, and Willa didn't push. She cleaned her plate, helped Elliot finish the beans, and left at 8:30 with the leftover beignets wrapped in foil for her ride home on the streetcar. She did not know that 2 of Aurelio's men followed the streetcar at a discreet distance every night, until she was safely inside her building in the Tremé. She didn't know a lot of things. The thing she definitely didn't know was the name Beaumont Delacroix. Beaumont Delacroix was 60 years old, with a shaved head and a collection of custom suits and a loan operation that functioned as the financial infrastructure for half the low-level criminal activity in the lower 9th Ward and Central City. He was not in Aurelio's league, not even close, but he had survived a long time by being useful, which was its own kind of power. Willa's older brother, Devlin, had borrowed money from Beaumont 2 years ago to cover the medical bills from their mother's cancer treatment. Their mother had since passed, and Devlin was working 2 jobs and making payments, but he'd fallen behind by 3 months when his car transmission died and wiped out his savings. Beaumont's collections manager had started calling Willa's number, because Devlin had listed her as a contact, just in case, and the calls had gotten progressively less polite. Last month, one of Beaumont's men had followed Willa to the diner after her morning shift and sat in a booth for 2 hours watching her work before leaving without ordering anything. Willa hadn't told anyone. She was used to carrying things quietly. She had been carrying things quietly for as long as she could remember. She started to unravel on a Wednesday, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the small ways that people who hold everything in eventually do. She was slower to laugh in Odette's room. She double-checked the locks on windows she'd never looked at twice before. She jumped at a car backfiring on the street outside and then laughed it off, but Aurelio saw her hands shake before she steadied them. He noticed the bruise on her wrist 3 days later, a grip bruise. 4 fingers unmistakable to someone who had spent his life in rooms where people left marks on each other. He waited until Elliot had taken Odette to her physical therapy appointment down the hall. He found Willa in the sitting room, folding a blanket with the meticulous focus of someone trying to give their hands something to do. "Who put that on your arm?" he said. It wasn't a question. Willa kept folding. "I bumped it on a shelf at the diner, Willa." Something in the way he said her name, just her name, no qualifier, no title, just the 2 syllables landing with the full weight of his attention, made her stop. She sat down on the settee and stared at the blanket in her hands. And then, because she was exhausted, and because she had been carrying it alone for months, and because he was looking at her like someone who was not going to look away, she told him, all of it. Devlin's debt, their mother, the man in the booth at the diner, the phone calls. The bruise, which had come from Beaumont's collector gripping her arm in the parking lot of her building last Friday morning, hissing a number at her. "I wasn't going to involve you," she said. "This isn't your problem." "You are in my house," Aurelio said quietly. "You are sitting with my grandmother every day. You have made this house feel like something again." He paused. "And you are one of the only people I have met in 20 years who came through that door without wanting something from me." Willa looked up. "Your brother's debt to Beaumont Delacroix," Aurelio said, "is not something you need to think about anymore, Aurelio. I am not asking you to do anything. I am not placing you in anyone's debt. I am telling you that a man put his hands on you to threaten you on a matter that has a very simple resolution." He stood, straightening his cuffs. "The only thing I want you to do is go sit with my grandmother. She sleeps better when you're in the next room." He left before she could argue. Beaumont Delacroix got the call Thursday evening, while he was having dinner at his regular table at a private restaurant in the Warehouse district that didn't take reservations from people who weren't already known. The call came from a number he recognized immediately, and he excused himself from the table to take it outside, in the rain, like the situation demanded. Aurelio's voice on the other end was not raised. It was never raised. That was the thing about Aurelio Santerre. He had no need for volume. The weight was in the precision, in the unhurried way he constructed a sentence and left certain words in it for you to carry home with you. He told Beaumont that Devlin Tatum's debt had been purchased. He told Beaumont that it was now settled, in full. He told Beaumont that any further contact, direct or through intermediaries, with either Devlin or Willa Tatum would constitute a personal offense against the Santerre family. He said the word personal with the kind of quietness that made it sound like a door closing on something final. Beaumont said yes. He said he understood completely. He said there would be no further contact. He meant all of it. Friday morning arrived grey and damp. Willa came through the front door at her usual time, shaking rain off her umbrella, and found Aurelio in the front hallway in an overcoat, holding a folded piece of paper. "Your brother's debt," he said, handing it to her. She opened it. It was a receipt, paid in full. Her throat tightened. "I told you I didn't want you to. You didn't want to owe anyone anything," he said. "I know. This isn't a debt." He looked at her steadily. "It's an act. Accept it as one." She looked at the paper for a long time. Then she looked at him. "Aurelio," she said. "You know I'm a waitress from the Tremé who volunteers on weekends and takes the streetcar home and shops at Winn-Dixie on Claiborne." "I know. And you know what you are. I know that too. Then, what is this?" She gestured vaguely between them, at the space that had been narrowing slowly and undeniably for weeks. He crossed the hallway. He was careful about it. Deliberate, not rushed, the way he did everything. He stopped close enough that she had to tilt her chin up slightly to look at him. "My grandmother," he said, "has been asking for you every morning since the day she met you 2 years ago at a shelter that didn't have enough money for decent equipment, but apparently had enough for you." She knows people. She has always known people. He paused. She told me last week on one of her clear days that you were the kind of woman who holds the world up without asking to be thanked for it. She told me not to be an idiot. Despite everything, Willa laughed. She couldn't help it. A surprised, real, unguarded laugh that lit her whole face up. That sounds like her. It does. Something softened in him that he had not planned for. I have spent my entire adult life surrounded by people who wanted to get close to me for what I control. You walked into this house to see an 83-year-old woman and brought her beignets. He reached up and brushed a strand of damp hair from her forehead with a deliberateness that made her breath stop. You are the most honest thing in my life, Willa. I don't know how else to say it. She didn't move. She was very still, the way she got sometimes when she was taking something in fully before she responded, processing it down to the bone, not just the surface. You scare me a little, she said honestly. I know, not for the reason you think. He waited. You scare me because I've spent a lot of years being very clear-eyed about what I am and where I fit, she said. And then, you look at me like. She stopped, started again. Like I'm not something to fit around. He said nothing. He just looked at her, and it was exactly the way she'd just described. That look, the one she hadn't been able to name for weeks. Like she was the fixed point in the room and everything else was arranged around her. She reached up and put her hand flat against his chest, feeling his heartbeat under her palm, steadier than she expected. And then she leaned forward and kissed him, slowly, without apology, without any of the self-consciousness she would have predicted from herself 30 seconds ago. Just her and him and the rain against the front windows and the smell of chicory drifting in from the kitchen where Elliot was making a fresh pot for Odette's morning. When she pulled back, his hand was at her waist, holding on with the particular grip of someone who doesn't intend to let go. I'm still taking the streetcar, she said. I know, and I'm not moving in here, I haven't asked. And I need to go sit with Miss Odette because she wakes up better when someone reads to her before Elliot comes in with her medication. She does, he agreed. The Chekhov stories. She likes the ones that don't resolve. Willa looked at him. She told me you used to read them to her when you were a boy. She tells people things. She does. Willa squeezed his hand once and stepped back. Give me an hour with her. Then you can have lunch with us both if you want. She's been asking why you don't come in during the mornings anymore. He followed her up the stairs at a slight distance, the way he did everything, with patience, with attention, watching the way she moved through his house like she'd always belonged there. In the weeks that followed, the Santerre estate changed in ways that were difficult to quantify, but impossible to ignore. The kitchen smelled different, better. The silences had different textures. The guards at the gate, who had always treated their post with a specific kind of controlled tension, started looking forward to the mornings because Willa would stop and ask about their families by name and sometimes bring them coffee in paper cups, which she handed over with the same straightforward warmth she brought to everything. Odette had more good days than bad. On one of those good days, clear-eyed, sharp herself, she held Willa's hand and looked at her with absolute lucidity and said, "You know what he needs, don't you?" Not saving, just witnessing, someone to look at him and see the whole thing and not look away. Willa thought about that for a long time. She thought about it on the streetcar home that evening, in the particular golden light that falls over New Orleans at the end of a good day, when the humidity drops just slightly and the city exhales, and for a moment it looks like exactly what it is, beautiful and complicated and completely irreversibly itself. She wasn't rich. She wasn't anyone's idea of a storybook heroine. She was a 26-year-old woman from the Tremé who had spent most of her life working too hard and being looked through and carrying things quietly in both hands, so no one else had to. But she had walked into a dying woman's room and been recognized on sight. She had walked into a house full of danger and been made safe. She had been witnessed, fully, by someone who saw exactly what she was. Every soft, warm, real inch of her, and had not looked away. The streetcar rocked gently beneath her. The city went by in the window, and Willa Mae Tatum, for the first time in longer than she could accurately say, let herself think that maybe this was what things looked like when they were going right.